My son wanted to kick me out of the house because on Christmas Eve I gave a bowl of soup to the neighbor. He just wanted a reason. On that Christmas Eve, what seemed like a simple gesture of kindness completely transformed my life. I only wanted to offer a little comfort to someone who had no one. But I ended up discovering that, inside my own home, the love I imagined to be unconditional had been worn out for a long time. It was as if that soup, warm and full of care, revealed what was hidden behind automatic smiles and uncomfortable silences. My story is about small choices that expose great truths. It is about how sometimes, a simple gesture is enough for masks to fall and the truth to reveal itself. And, above all, it is about how we find strength where we thought there was only pain. I am very happy to have you here with me. Follow my story to the end and comment on which city you are watching from. I want to know how far this story can reach. The smell of vegetable soup filled the kitchen like a familiar embrace. As I chopped the last seasonings, I felt a rare calm, the kind that comes when you do something out of pure care. The supper was ready, and even before setting my table, I separated a deep bowl with affection for the neighbor in apartment 302. James had been sick for days, alone with no family nearby. I took the plate, a folded napkin, and walked to his door with firm and serene steps. He answered with a muffled cough, surprised to see me there with that simple gesture. His eyes watered even before he said a word. When I handed him the plate, his trembling hand touched mine, and there was more gratitude there than in any speech. "No one ever does this for me," he whispered. I just smiled and wished him a good night. I went back home feeling that, even with everything, my heart still knew how to be a shelter. It wasn't charity nor pity. It was just the reflection of someone who learned, since she was a girl, that helping others also heals our own wounds. His pain reminded me of mine, and perhaps that was why I wanted so much to ease it. I gathered the kitchen utensils and went to prepare my own meal, with that comforting silence in the background. It was then that I heard the front door open. Michael had arrived. I was still smiling on the inside. His grateful smile would warm me more than any fireplace. Michael watched the scene through the kitchen window. I didn't even notice he was there until I heard the icy tone in his voice. "Are you distributing soup now?" I turned surprised and tried to explain, but he continued with that severe expression. He spoke about appearances, about what the neighbors would say, as if my compassion put our reputation at risk. Every word of his hurt me more than any open criticism. It wasn't the tone, it was the coldness. I tried to take a deep breath and stay calm. I argued that James was alone, sick, and that no one else seemed to care. Michael retorted, saying that we are not responsible for others, and that my attitude seemed like neediness or madness. I felt my face flush, not with shame but with disappointment. How could he, who grew up seeing my effort to care for others, speak to me that way? There was something different about him, something I couldn't yet name. He had always been a proud boy but also kind. Now he seemed more worried about what others would think than about any human pain. His words were pushing me away inch by inch, as if I were standing before a stranger. And maybe I was. The truth is that that argument wasn't even about soup. It was about who we become when we forget who we were. I finally fell silent, holding back tears. He, impatient, accused me of living in an imaginary world. I just wanted silence. I went to my room like someone fleeing a war, leaving behind the last image of him, arms crossed and eyes distant. He was no longer the boy I raised. The dawn brought a heaviness that not even the blanket could relieve. Still hearing echoes of the argument, I sat on the edge of the bed trying to understand when everything had started to go wrong. Michael knocked on the bedroom door and for a moment, I thought he was going to apologize. But no. His face was too serious. He stayed silent for long seconds and then said, "Maybe it's better for you to look for another place to stay. It doesn't work here anymore." My body froze. I blinked a few times, thinking I had misunderstood. I asked with a choked voice if he was really suggesting that I leave the house I helped build, where every corner carried my story. He didn't answer, just looked away. That was worse than a scream. I knew then that the bond between us had been undone for a long time. Only the final tear remained. I didn't scream, I didn't beg. I just stood up, with a dignity that hid my shattered heart. I knew his resentment came from places I might never completely understand. But nothing justified that cruelty. His rejection was like being expelled from one's own existence. And worse still, it was realizing that he seemed to feel nothing while saying that. I lay down again, but I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling, feeling that something inside me had changed forever. My son was no longer mine. Or perhaps he never had been. That night, I realized my son was only waiting for a reason. The next day arrived like an unwanted stranger. The sunlight didn't warm. It only invaded the cold rooms of the house like a reminder that time does not stop to console us. Michael left early without saying anything. Samantha, his wife, crossed the rooms with a gentle smile, but too fragile to sustain any balance. She tried to talk, but avoided the real subject, as if ignoring it would make it disappear. I kept to myself. I cooked for myself, washed my dishes, and took my clothes off the line as if I were a guest. The house, which used to have daily noises, now only returned the sound of my footsteps. No invitation to family dinner. No cup of tea offered. Just the space between bodies growing like an invisible wall. Samantha looked at me with pity, and that was almost worse than anger. I didn't want compassion, I wanted belonging. I wanted the right to be heard, to be considered part of something. But the atmosphere was different. A mixture of stifled guilt and uncomfortable convenience. I was the living reminder of something they wanted to forget. And that hurt more than I was prepared to admit. On a cold afternoon, I sat on the empty sofa in the living room and looked at the photographs on the shelf. In all of them, frozen smiles from a time that would not return. I realized that my place was just a memory. My footsteps echoed as if I no longer belonged there. I knocked on James's door again, now without the soup, but with a heart still heavy. He received me with that same tired but true look. We talked little at first, enough for him to notice that something was wrong. He asked if I was okay, and for the first time in days I felt like answering with sincerity. I said only that it was difficult, and he nodded like someone who has heard that many times. We sat on the small balcony of his apartment, with 2 mugs of hot tea between us. James began to speak without me asking. He told me about the daughter he hadn't seen in years, about the loneliness that became routine, about the silence that no one bothers to listen to. There was no drama in his words, just a hard and quiet acceptance. That touched me deeply. As he spoke, I realized that pain was not just his. It was ours. I was also being discarded, replaced, ignored. But there, with him, that pain transformed into a bridge. His presence brought me a different peace, that of someone who understands without judging. I didn't need to explain anything. He already knew. When I said goodbye, there was no real farewell. Just the complicit look of someone who doesn't need to say anything else. I went back home lighter. Or at least less invisible. It was strange how he understood me without me saying anything. That night, Michael arrived earlier. I sat at the table with a last hope that perhaps finally we could talk. But he didn't even wait for me to open my mouth. He said he had thought a lot and that, with all due respect, he no longer wanted the responsibility of caring for me. That this was overburdening his life, his marriage, his plans. I didn't know if I should breathe or cry. Every word of his was a knife sheathed in formality. He spoke like someone reading a statement, impersonal, calculated, decided. I tried to remember the boy who asked for my lap when he had nightmares. I tried to find traces of that love in his eyes. But all I saw was convenience. He wanted to get rid of a weight, and I was that weight now. I wanted to scream, to say that I never asked to be there. That everything I did was out of love. But I held back. I replied only that I understood. And in that instant I really understood he wasn't cruel. He had just changed. He had simply become someone I no longer recognized. That indeed hurt. I got up from the table with my soul in pieces. There was no longer any reason to pretend that this was a home. His rejection was an ending without ceremony. He spoke as if I were a weight. A hindrance. It had been days since I avoided opening the mail accumulated in the kitchen drawer. It was an automatic task, unimportant, until an envelope caught my attention. The sender was a geriatric clinic with a cold, impersonal name. I opened it cautiously, feeling my stomach tighten. Inside, brochures, forms, terms. It wasn't generic advertising. It was specific documentation, addressed to Michael. I went through the papers, my heart racing. There were 3 different clinics, all specialized in care for the elderly with cognitive difficulties. I read and reread in disbelief. My name was written on 2 forms not yet filled out. No conversation, no warning. Just that. A decision being drawn far from me. Suddenly, all the silence of the last few days took on a new outline, that of a plan that wasn't mine. My hands were trembling. I thought about confronting him immediately, but something stopped me. I put the papers back, leaving no trace. This needed to be confirmed. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it was just research. But a voice inside me whispered that it wasn't. It was real. And it was cruel. I needed someone to trust. Someone who wasn't inside that game of appearances and justifications. I waited for night to fall, sat alone in the living room, pretending nothing had changed. But inside, everything was already different. It was like living with an enemy disguised as a son. Why would he be researching this without consulting me? The next day I went to Clara, the only person I could truly count on. I took one of the letters hidden in my purse and showed it to her with teary eyes. Clara stayed silent for a long moment, reading every line with attention. Then she got up without saying anything and grabbed her laptop. We started to investigate. What we discovered made my blood run cold. Michael had already made contact with 2 of those clinics. There were exchanged emails, requested quotes, legal terms regarding involuntary commitment. On one of the sites there was a restricted area for family members, and he had created an account. Clara, with her technological skill, managed to access some records. And there it was, a simulation of commitment for me with justifications written by him. The allegation? Voluntary isolation and emotional confusion. My mouth went dry. I felt a dizziness that forced me to sit down. He was deciding my fate as if I weren't alive, conscious, lucid. As if I were just a problem to be removed. An annoyance. A hindrance. His words from last week now took on a more perverse meaning. It wasn't just an outburst. It was a project. A premeditated decision. Clara held my hand. I didn't know if I should cry, scream, or run away. It was all too absurd to be real. But there, in front of the documents, the dates, the intentions, only one truth remained: he was erasing me. He signed the papers as if I were nothing. I returned home later that night, still in shock. Clara insisted I sleep at her apartment, but I needed to face what was left of my life. Samantha was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with headphones on. I waited for her to notice me. When she did, I took off one of the headphones gently and said in a serene tone, "You knew about the clinics, didn't you?" She froze. The knife stopped in the air for a second. Her eyes, usually calm, became agitated. She tried to smile, deny, say it was just an idea Michael was exploring as a precaution. But her voice trembled, and her expression betrayed more than she said. I insisted, asking if she thought that was right. If she thought I needed to be institutionalized against my will, as if I were a burden. Samantha recoiled. She said she didn't agree with everything, but that she didn't have the strength to oppose him. That she was trying to keep the peace. It was a weak excuse and she knew it. But it was also a cry for help. She knew what was happening. And somehow she was also afraid. Afraid of Michael. Afraid of what they would become if he crossed one more line. From that moment on, I understood that I wasn't just being silenced. I was being erased while everyone around pretended it was out of care. She knew. And she was afraid too. In that sleepless dawn, I sat in the armchair in my room and stared at the old frame on the dresser. It was Michael at age 6, hugging my neck, smiling a toothless smile. I remembered that afternoon at the park, how he cried when he fell off his bicycle and even bleeding said, "Mommy, hold me tight and it will go away." Where did that sweet boy get lost? In what part of the path did I let him go dark? The memories came in waves. The nights awake with fever. The snacks prepared with encouraging notes. The stories I invented just to make him sleep. I gave everything I had. Everything. And now that same boy saw me as a burden. As someone he needed to hide. Institutionalize. Silence. The pain of this was sharper than any fight. It was the sensation of having failed in my most sacred role. I tried to look for rational explanations, but the truth was rawer. Sometimes love doesn't save. Sometimes, even with all efforts, people choose to turn away from the light. Michael grew up surrounded by care but chose control. And perhaps I spent too much time trying to protect him from everything, including himself. The photograph in my hand was trembling. Not from the cold, but because that portrait was of a boy who no longer existed. And I needed to accept that. My sweet boy had disappeared. At breakfast the next morning, I sat at Clara's table with a cup in my hands. She looked at me firmly, but also with tenderness. She said this couldn't continue like this, that I wasn't alone even if it seemed so, and that there were still paths, legal, emotional, human, to recover my dignity. Her words met me in a place where there was still a spark. We talked about lawyers' rights, protective measures, but we also talked about internal rescue. Clara reminded me of who I was before all this, a strong, creative, sensitive woman. That what they were trying to do to me wasn't just an injustice, it was an attempt at erasure. And that if I didn't react they would win. But not because they were right, but because I let them. I took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks something inside me moved. Still weak but present. It was the idea that maybe I could still fight. That my story didn't need to end in that dark room. That there were still people like Clara, like James, who saw me. Who believed in me. She held my hand and said, "You still have a choice, Helen. And I will be with you." And there, for the first time, I wanted to choose. Choose for myself. Maybe I still have a choice. It was Clara who introduced me to Rachel, a social worker with a calm look and a firm voice. I went to the community center on a cloudy late afternoon, my heart tight but determined. Rachel received me in a simple, welcoming room. We sat facing each other, and she offered me tea even before starting any questions. That small gesture made me breathe deeper. I began speaking little by little, testing the words. I told her about Michael, about the institutionalization plan, about the heavy silence surrounding me. She didn't interrupt me. She didn't rush me. She just listened. Her eyes didn't wander. There was no judgment on her face. When I finished, there was a silence between us, but it was a silence full of understanding. Rachel then spoke calmly. She said that what I was going through wasn't rare, and that there were ways to protect myself. She spoke about autonomy, about respect for the dignity of the elderly, about rights I perhaps didn't even know I had. She wrote everything down, but she did it delicately, as if every detail of my story deserved to be recorded. I left there with a paper in my hands, but more than that, with the weight off my chest. Someone had listened to me. Someone saw me as a human being, not as a burden. And that, in that moment, was everything. She listened to me as if I really mattered. Samantha entered my room without knocking. Her eyes were red, her face pale. For an instant, I thought it was another attempt to convince me to accept the best for everyone. But no. She was trembling. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding a crumpled tissue, and began to speak. She said she couldn't take it anymore. That she needed to tell me something she had kept for years. Her words came out broken, as if fighting against herself. She confessed that, from the beginning, she felt threatened by my presence. That she was never able to be the wife Michael idealized because I was always around, like a reminder of the perfect woman, the mother he idolized. She said that, over time, she began to see me as an obstacle, and that this envy corroded her, even without her wanting it to. That shocked me. I had never noticed. I always thought our coexistence was cordial, respectful. It never crossed my mind that she felt diminished. But there, between tears and choked words, Samantha exposed the truth. She had collaborated with the plan to push me away because she wanted to finally feel in control of her own house. She wanted to be heard. To be the only one. To be enough. I couldn't hate her. There was no malice in her face, only pain. An old pain neglected like so many others. And perhaps for the first time I saw who she really was, and how much she also needed to be seen. All she wanted was to feel in control. After Samantha's revelation, I couldn't keep silent anymore. It was time to face Michael. I waited for him to arrive from work, kept myself firm, and asked to talk. He accepted with impatience, as if he already knew what was coming. I sat before him in the living room, with my hands joined on my lap. I told him what I knew, the clinics, the documents, the plan. I asked with a firm voice why. He laughed without humor. He said that I always needed to be the center of everything. That, since Samantha joined the family, I made a point of showing who was in charge. Surprised, I tried to argue, but he didn't want to listen. He accused me of manipulating everyone with suffocating kindness, of having sabotaged his relationships with my veiled opinions and loaded silences. Every phrase was like a slap to the soul. I was stunned. I never imagined he saw me that way. I believed that a mother's love withstood all interpretations. But he saw me as a threat, as an emotional weight that grew until it became unbearable. And in an attempt to free himself, he chose the cruelest way, to erase me from his own history. I tried to reply, but he stood up, saying there was nothing else to discuss. Only the echo of his words remained with me, weighing more than any silence. He spat words like stones. The next day I told Rachel everything. She listened with attention, writing in her notebook with the same habitual calm. When I finished, she looked at me over her glasses and asked, "Do you know in whose name this house is?" My breath failed. I never thought about that. I simply assumed everything was still as it had always been. Rachel then suggested it would be prudent to check the documents, just to be sure. That set off an alarm inside me. What if there was more hidden? What if the attempt at institutionalization was just one piece of a larger plan? Rachel explained that, unfortunately, this type of situation is more common than I imagined. That many women like me only discover what was taken from them when it is already too late. Clara offered to help me, and I, with a tight heart, accepted. That house was more than walls. It was where I raised my son, where I built memories, where I planted every flower in the garden. Thinking that it could have been taken from me in silence left me groundless. Rachel prepared a list of documents we should look for, and Clara was in charge of organizing everything. It was at that moment that something firmed up inside me. I would no longer be a spectator of my own story. Now I would investigate every line, every signature. It was time to discover the truth. Something told me there was more behind this. We spent hours among old folders, yellowed contracts, envelopes forgotten in the back of drawers. Clara read every line with surgical attention. I, by her side, felt the weight of every sheet as if I carried my own memory on paper. At first, everything seemed in order. Old deeds, bill records, receipts. But then Clara froze in front of a page. She pulled the paper closer to the light. It was a property transfer contract. My name was listed as voluntary transfer of the house to Michael. And at the bottom of the page there was my supposed signature. The problem is that I had never signed that. Never. I would recognize my handwriting anywhere. And that was a crude copy, although well done. It was fake. Clara looked at me, her face tense. I could barely breathe. We went through the other papers looking for dates, stamps, anything that confirmed the legality of that document. There was even a registry office record. Everything indicated that, on paper, the house had not been mine for almost a year. I was never informed. I was never consulted. Michael had done this in the shadows, silently, like someone erasing a presence. I felt my throat close. The sofa where I sat every day, the garden I watered, the pictures on the wall. All of that was no longer mine. Without me noticing, he took everything from me, including the ground I walked on. My signature. But I never signed that. The pain soon gave way to anger. I went to Rachel with all the documents in hand. I showed the fake signature, the correspondence history, the clinic records. She kept calm, but I saw her expression harden. She said this was serious. Very serious. That it was patrimonial fraud and possible abuse of vulnerability. There were, according to her, sufficient elements to start a legal process. Rachel introduced me to a lawyer from the community center. He was straight to the point. It was possible to legally contest the transfer of the house, request a handwriting analysis, and suspend any institutionalization action based on the document forgery. But for that, I would need to be willing to fight. To expose myself. To face Michael head-on. I nodded. There were no more doubts. I could no longer protect anyone, not even myself, with silence. It was time to speak. To defend myself. To demand justice, even if the process was long, painful. Rachel then initiated the procedures. The first notifications and protocols were drafted. While signing the papers with my true signature, I felt something different run through my body. It was as if, finally, I had returned to existence. He had already taken everything from me, without me noticing. At the end of that afternoon, Clara accompanied me to the public defender's office. I carried with me a folder full of proof, but also something new: courage. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't asking for permission. I was demanding respect. Rachel smiled when she saw me and said, "Now it's official. Let's open the case." And so it was done. The first petition was filed that same week. The following days were intense. Meetings, reports, scheduled expert analyses. Time seemed to run fast and slow at the same time. Clara remained by my side through everything. Samantha, despite the fear, started avoiding Michael whenever possible. The atmosphere of the house was unbearable. But inside me a new strength was emerging. I knew who I was. I knew what they were trying to do to me. And now I had a voice. Rachel guided me in every step. She spoke with clarity but without rushing. She helped me understand my rights, my limits, my possibilities. It was no longer about beating Michael. It was about recovering what was mine: dignity, home, peace. And this time I wouldn't give that up for anyone. The process was underway. And with it, a version of myself that I thought I had lost forever. The war had begun. Clara received me with a tight hug, the kind that doesn't ask for explanations. Her house was small but welcoming, full of plants and books, as if every corner breathed calm. I spent the first few days in silence, listening to the sound of the wind in the windows and allowing myself, little by little, to exist without startles. It was strange to live without tension, without expecting a slamming door or a hardened voice questioning me. In that temporary home, I found a space to rebuild pieces of myself that had been shattered. Clara made a point of maintaining a quiet routine. Breakfast always came with a flower on the table. At night we watched old movies and drank tea. Sometimes she just sat next to me in silence, and that was enough. I relearned the value of small things, listening to my own thoughts, sleeping a whole night, eating slowly. The haste and fear had been replaced by a silent lightness. It was almost a rehabilitation of the soul. I wrote in a notebook for the first time in years. Small sentences, memories, thoughts. Clara said that putting what hurts on paper is like taking poison out of the body. Little by little, I felt my breathing return to its natural rhythm. I started to take care of myself as I used to take care of others, with attention, with affection. That pause wasn't an escape. It was survival. It was an act of self-love. On the third night I fell asleep without tears, without anguish in my chest. Just with a slight smile, like someone rediscovering a home within herself. Sleeping without fear was a luxury I had forgotten. It was almost noon when Samantha appeared at Clara's door. Her eyes were hollow, visibly shaken. Clara received her with reserve but understood that that visit was necessary. We sat on the balcony and she took a few minutes to start talking. Her tone was low, almost a whisper. She said she had lied to herself for too long, and that she could no longer sustain that facade. She confessed that she felt guilty from the start, but fear of Michael always paralyzed her. She cried, saying she never wanted to hurt me, that she lost herself trying to please him. She revealed that the marriage had been crumbling for a long time, and that her presence in the house only accentuated everything that was missing between them. "Seeing you there reminded me of what I was never able to be," she said. It was hard to hear, but there was truth in every word. I asked her to breathe. I said that, despite everything, there was still time to act with courage. Samantha held my hand tightly, as if that were an anchor. She said she wanted to help, that she bitterly regretted it. I don't know if it was too late, but I felt she spoke from the bottom of her heart. And in that instant I stopped seeing her as an enemy. She was just another woman lost amidst unattainable expectations. The farewell was silent, but in her eyes, there was a request for forgiveness that words could not translate. She cried as if she were washing her soul. At the end of that afternoon, I went to visit James. I took an orange cake that Clara had made. We sat on the balcony as always. The sky was gray, and the wind blew strong as if carrying unspoken words. James looked at me calmly and said, "I think it's time for me to tell you the truth about me." That caught me by surprise. I never pressured him, but there was a silent mystery around him. He began by telling me that, a few years ago, his children declared him unfit. They said he could no longer live alone, that he was becoming confused. They institutionalized him for months without real necessity. It was Clara who helped him get out of that institution and recover his autonomy. He lost his house, his car, access to his own money. He only managed to start over because he had someone who believed in him. I stayed silent, feeling the weight of that story. It was as if our paths had crossed for a greater reason. James looked at me with a half smile and said, "The difference between old and disposable is who is holding the pen." And in that instant I understood that what they were trying to do to me wasn't personal. It was structural. It was a way of erasing what bothers, what no longer serves, what feels too much. His pain was mine. And, together, we were the portrait of an entire forgotten generation. We were both left behind for the same reason: too much humanity. The following week, Clara took me to the neighborhood library. I was surprised to see dozens of chairs organized in a circle, posters with supportive phrases, and familiar faces. She had gathered friends, neighbors, former students from the sewing course, even local merchants. Everyone was there for me. A community movement of support, built with care, indignation, and affection. I caught my breath for an instant. People spoke, each in their own way, about how I had impacted their lives. One lady remembered the clothes I sewed for her son. Another told how I helped her go back to school. Even a teenager came to thank me for an old piece of advice that stopped him from giving up on school. I could barely hold back the tears. Those gestures lifted me up one by one. I never imagined so many saw me. That, behind the forced loneliness, there was a silent network watching me with affection. Clara said that this was just the beginning. That giving visibility to my case was important, but showing who I was beyond the conflict was even more powerful. For the first time, my story wasn't a secret whisper between four walls. It was a flame being lit in other people. And in that modest hall, surrounded by common people, I felt a strength that not even fear could extinguish. I never imagined so many saw me. In the following weeks, I participated in meetings and conversation circles. I shared my story with other women, with the elderly, with young people who wanted to understand what was happening. At first, my voice trembled. The words wavered between my teeth. But seeing the attentive eyes before me, something inside firmed up. I was no longer a silent victim. I was a narrator of truths. Speaking set me free. And it freed others too. People began to emerge with similar stories, with marks left by children, grandchildren, relatives who transformed care into control. Pain became a bridge. Listening became a weapon. Every meeting was a reaffirmation: we are not alone. We never were. We were just silenced too much. Clara said my voice was now an instrument of transformation. And I believed it. It didn't matter anymore if my story had started with rejection. The important thing was how it was rebuilding itself with courage, with truth. There was power in sharing. There was healing in every word spoken. At the last meeting, when I finished speaking, there was silence. And then applause. I smiled. Still trembling but whole. My voice trembled, but no one looked away. Rachel called me for an urgent conversation. She said a journalist from the local radio station had become interested in the case. An investigative reporter, known for giving voice to ignored stories. We met at the community center, and he listened to everything, asking questions with respect and intelligence. He wanted to understand how a lucid and active woman almost was institutionalized and stripped of everything by a son who claimed to act out of love. He recorded the interview. Then he spoke with Clara, with James, with Rachel. He collected documents, photos, reports. In a few days, the program aired. And the response was immediate. Neighbors called. Denouncements began to surface. Other families recognized themselves in my story. It was as if suddenly someone had turned on a light in an old basement. I wasn't the only one. And now I was no longer invisible. Michael heard the report. He sent messages, furious. He tried to intimidate me with old words, but they no longer carried the same weight. Now there were eyes on him. There were people attentive, indignant, ready to act. Justice was in motion, but public opinion was too. It was a double force, relentless. And I finally didn't need to hide anymore. Now he could no longer silence me. The weeks following the scandal were a silent earthquake in Michael's life. The report had gained strength, and his name circulated in forums, social networks, and meetings at his own company. Colleagues began to avoid him, invitations disappeared, important contracts were suspended. The image of the model's son, exemplary husband, and upright professional was cracked. And with it, his security. I heard through the building corridors that he had been temporarily suspended. Samantha stopped going out with him in public. The mask he had sustained for years was shattering in front of everyone. I saw when he passed through the garden, his gaze low, his steps short. For the first time, he seemed small. For the first time, he didn't see me as an enemy, but as someone who could destroy him. And then he came. He rang the doorbell at Clara's house with hesitant hands, wrinkled clothes, and a rehearsed speech. He wanted to talk. He said it was all a misunderstanding, that he regretted it, that he didn't know what he was doing, that he was confused, pressured, afraid of losing me. But his eyes didn't ask for forgiveness. They asked for salvation, and that I could not offer. He fell silent when he realized I wouldn't get up to hug him. For the first time, control was in my hands, and that terrified him. For the first time, he looked at me with fear. We sat on the balcony, distant. Michael tried to smile, but it was an empty, calculated smile. He started recalling childhood moments, talking about his favorite cake, about the day we fell into the pool together. But there was something artificial in that sudden memory. I listened to him in silence, observing every word like someone analyzing a memorized text. He hadn't come out of regret. He came because he had nowhere else to run. He tried to change strategy. He said I could come back home, that everything could be resolved as a family. He repeated words like unity, new beginning, trust. But I knew that tone. It was the same one he used to convince me that I was exaggerating, that the problem was my sensitivity. It was the voice of the manipulator, dressed in affection. I took a deep breath. I remembered the pain, the attempts at erasure, the fake signature. I remembered Rachel, Clara, James. I remembered me. The woman I was, the woman I am becoming again. And I knew that there was no more room for that kind of love, the kind that charges silence as the currency of affection. He insisted one more time, and I just smiled without saying yes or no, because I already knew what was coming. I already knew that tone. And I was no longer fooled. The next day he returned. He knocked on the door with flowers in his hand. It was the same bouquet he took to Samantha when he wanted to cover up some failure. He said he needed to talk for real this time. But I didn't open the door. I just listened. On the other side, he spoke about family, forgiveness, reconstruction. He promised to change. But it was late. My decision was already made. I waited for him to leave and then wrote a short letter. Not out of anger, but out of closure. I said I didn't hate him, but that I could no longer allow him to occupy a place of trust in my life. That it hurt me more to deny the love I invented for him than to accept the truth he chose to live. And that there was no return for those who cross certain limits. I left the letter with Clara, who delivered it by hand. I received no reply, but I didn't need one either. The silence this time was my shield. For the first time I was firm. For the first time I said no. And by doing that I felt an immense weight lift off my back. Because I was no longer the guilty mother. I was a woman under reconstruction. It was the first time I said no to him. The courtroom was packed. I never imagined so many people would come. Rachel, Clara, James, Samantha, everyone present. Including neighbors, old faces from the neighborhood. People who recognized me from the report and wanted to show support. The judge entered with a serious but calm expression. There was an air of solemnity in the environment. I sat with my hands on my knees, trying to keep my breathing steady. Michael's lawyer tried to maintain composure, but the papers in his hand were trembling. On the other side of the room, he avoided looking at me. The judge asked for silence and began the session. Rachel made the introduction of the case with precision. The forged documents were displayed. The recordings, the copies, the witnesses. Everything was part of a well-constructed web. It was the truth finally being heard. Every word hung in the air. And yet there was hope. I saw it in the looks around me. Michael tried to keep his pose, but he was sweating. He was facing what he feared most, exposure. There, he wasn't the exemplary son, nor the controlled executive. He was just a man trying to erase a woman and failing. The judge adjusted his glasses. It was the moment of the decision. The judge adjusted his glasses, ready for the decision. Before the sentence was given, I had the right to the final word. I stood up with firm legs even though my heart was racing. I looked at the judge, then at the audience, and finally at Michael. I said I had been silent for too long, that I bore the weight of guilt, fear, rejection, but that there were limits to everything, and that I was there to reaffirm mine. I spoke of the dignity they tried to take from me, of the house, the freedom, the peace. I recalled the days I doubted my own sanity, my memory, my worth. And that now, looking at all this, I saw how much I annulled myself in the name of a love that only existed as long as I was useful. But not anymore. My voice was mine. My life too. Michael tried to laugh, as he always did when he wanted to change the subject. But no one else laughed with him. Not Samantha. Not the judge. He was alone, surrounded by truths he could not deny. And I, for the first time in a long time, was whole. There, in that room, I wasn't the victim. I was the woman who survived and had the courage to speak. He tried to laugh. But no one else was laughing with him. The judge read the sentence clearly. The transfer of the house was annulled, recognized as fraud. Legal rights were restored, and Michael received a judicial warning for patrimonial abuse and attempted forced institutionalization. The decision was received with silence, but a silence that pulsed with relief. I didn't cry. I just closed my eyes and let the moment pass through me. Michael left the room hurriedly, without looking back. His posture was no longer arrogant. It was that of someone defeated, exposed, alone. Samantha followed him with slow steps. I didn't call them. There was nothing left to be said. There the past was buried. And with it the weight I carried for so long. Rachel hugged me. Clara too. Even James appeared, with a shy smile and watery eyes. The community surrounded me, as if protecting something precious. And perhaps it was just that, my story, my struggle, my rebirth. Not as a wounded mother, but as a whole woman finally heard. I left the room with my head held high. The world was the same. But I wasn't. In that moment I was reborn. Not as a wounded mother, but as a whole woman. Now I am curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you been through something similar? Support the channel, subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. I am leaving on the end screen another story that you will also like, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.